It's not the story they tell you that is important. It's what they omit. It's not the story they tell you that is important. It's what they omit. It's not the story they tell you that is important. It's what they omit. It's not the story they tell you that is important. It's what they omit. It's not the story they tell you that is important. It's what they omit. It's not the story they tell you that is important. It's what they omit.
Inside Job: Blueprint for an American Color Revolution. Part 7: The Statute as Authorities, Precedents Weaponized. Follow the architecture. Understand the blueprint.
It's not the story they tell you that is important. It's what they omit.
Six parts, one companion piece, 100,000 words on the record.
Seven federal statutes, the same elements analysis, applied symmetrically to both sides of the architecture.
Dark money networks operate on a massive scale, moving hundreds of millions of dollars through complex, nonprofit architectures. To regulate this, the federal government relies on exactly 7 statutory frameworks written to constrain political tax-exempt organizations. Of those 7, one stands apart. Internal Revenue Code Section 4958 doesn't guess intent. It relies entirely on objective math. The statute works by providing clear legal elements, strict financial penalties, and explicit enforcement authority to established agencies. Despite its technical structure, this specific framework remains almost entirely unused at the federal level. We are going to conduct a strict prosecutorial-grade walk of this statute. We will apply its elements symmetrically, testing the documented conduct of both right-wing and left-wing political architectures against the exact text of the law. Before 1996, the IRS faced a massive enforcement gap. If individuals abused a charity's assets, the agency's only option was a nuclear one: revoke the organization's tax-exempt status entirely. That made enforcement politically radioactive and functionally impossible. Congress solved this in 1996 with intermediate sanctions. The law punishes the individuals exploiting a charity, not the organization itself. The penalty is brutal: a 25% excise tax on the excess benefit, escalating to 200% if uncorrected. The law defines these targets as disqualified persons. This label captures anyone in a position to exercise substantial influence over the organization, independent of their official job title. The regulatory authority to enforce this sits directly with the Tax-Exempt and Government Entities Division of the IRS. Section 4958 exists for a specific congressional purpose: to prevent tax-exempt organizational assets from enriching the political operatives who direct them. This worked example maps Leonard Leo's network. Step 1 requires a tax-exempt organization. The 85 Fund is a 501c3 charity, and the Concord Fund a 501c4. Step 2 targets the disqualified person. Leo controls these nonprofits while operating his for-profit firms. This document outlines Step 3. Between 2016 and 2024, approximately $73 million to over $100 million transferred from the nonprofits Leo directs into his for-profit entities, like CRC Advisors. The central legal test asks a straightforward question: does the actual market value of the consulting services provided by those firms equal the tens of millions of dollars paid for them? If the value of those services does not equal the consideration received, the mathematical difference constitutes an illegal excess benefit transaction. We apply those exact same statutory elements to a mirroring left-wing architecture. The Wellspring Philanthropic Fund is a 501c3 public charity, satisfying the first element. This text highlights the second element. Matan B. Setter LLC operates as a vehicle controlled by individuals who hold substantial directional influence over Wellspring's grant-making. Wellspring transferred $124.2 million into this anonymous Delaware LLC. The legal question here is identical. Do the administrative and pass-through services provided by that LLC actually equal the $124 million it absorbed? Both networks rely heavily on donor-advised funds as intermediaries, but the indirect transaction regulation, found at 26 CFR 53.4958-4, cuts right through that structure. If the intermediary lacks an independent exempt purpose, the law treats the funds as passing directly from the charity to the operative. Using a pass-through entity successfully obscures the audit trail from the public. Under federal tax regulations, however, it provides zero legal insulation. The substantial influence test captures elected officials operating in their official capacities. Governor Gavin Newsom and the Tides Center maintain a reciprocal funding relationship. By redirecting state funds to Tides, while simultaneously relying on Tides for private requests, the arrangement creates a loop of substantial influence. This regulatory framework also maps the flow of operational funds deployed during elections. In 2020, the Hopewell Fund paid $9.6 million to Perkins Coie. During that exact period, Mark Elias directed both the firm receiving the money and the fund sending it. These financial mechanisms are embedded deep within the established political apparatus. There is precedent for federal agencies tracking these operational funds. A 2022 FEC settlement confirmed the Hillary for America campaign misreported its Perkins Coie payments. Whether the subject is a governor, a campaign architect, or an anonymous donor, the tax code maps directional influence with mathematical indifference. Executing an excess benefit transaction of this magnitude requires systemic paperwork to hide the money from public view. That paperwork triggers a secondary, highly aggressive federal statute. Section 1001 governs materially false statements made to the United States government. This section of the legal analysis details how both networks misclassify these self-dealing transfers. By labeling millions of dollars in related party transactions as generic consulting or legal services on their IRS Form 990 filings, they submit documentation capable of influencing the IRS's enforcement decisions. The layered penalty for this misclassification carries severe consequences, including up to 5 years of federal imprisonment for every materially false statement. Because these IRS forms are signed and filed annually, each consecutive year multiplies the legal exposure into separate, distinct statutory violations. These operatives have extracted millions in tax-exempt wealth, and by repeatedly signing these federal filings, they have willingly built their own prosecutorial paper trails. The statutory elements are met. They are verified by the documentary record and appear uniformly across both sides of the political architecture. Yet the enforcement reality is stark. As of right now, the only active investigation into this massive architecture is a single state-level probe led by the District of Columbia Attorney General, targeting only the conservative network. That lone investigation faces an intense, coordinated procedural counterpressure campaign. Subpoena threats from the House Judiciary Committee and formal opposition letters from 12 Republican state attorneys general are actively trying to force the probe to close. Meanwhile, the left-side architecture sits entirely uninvestigated, operating untouched despite matching the exact same legal elements. The broader legal environment is shifting. Following the Supreme Court's decision to overturn the Chevron deference doctrine, federal agencies can no longer easily narrow the interpretation of these statutes, reopening the interpretive landscape directly to the courts. The prosecutorial walk is complete. The law exists, the math works, the paper trail is signed, and the statutory elements are met. The federal code already contains the statutory mechanisms to dismantle the modern dark money machine. It is simply waiting for an institution to apply them.
Imagine building a multi-million-dollar political empire, right? Entirely on a regulatory loophole.
Oh, yeah.
And then you wake up one morning and find out the Supreme Court just erased that loophole from existence. Welcome to the deep dive.
It is a pretty wild scenario to think about.
It really is. And, if you're someone who wants to understand the actual mechanics of how the world works without drowning in thousands of pages of legal jargon, today's topic is an absolute goldmine.
Yeah, it's incredibly revealing.
We are looking at this fascinating document published back in April 2026. It's part of a series by a writer named Tor, and this specific installment is titled Inside Job, Part 7, the Statute Book.
Right.
And our mission today is to unpack this document for you, because what it does is highly unusual. It takes the massive, complex, billion-dollar dark money architectures that fund both the American political left and the political right, and it asks a singular, highly clinical question.
Which is, does their behavior actually violate federal law?
Exactly. Does it actually break the law?
Yeah. It is a remarkable piece of analytical work. I mean, the author explicitly states right out of the gate that this isn't an opinion piece, and it certainly isn't, political advocacy.
Okay.
It's designed to be a prosecutorial-grade statutory walk. It strips away the partisan noise that usually surrounds these conversations, right?
Yeah.
And it simply compares the documented real-world conduct of these massive organizations against the actual text of the federal statutes.
The actual laws written by Congress to constrain them.
Precisely.
Okay, so let's unpack this. But before we go any further, we need to be crystal clear about something.
Yeah, the disclaimer.
All right, the source material covers highly charged political organizations on both the left and the right. We are not taking sides here, and we are not endorsing the viewpoints of these organizations or the author.
Absolutely not.
Our job today is strictly to impartially report on the legal analysis contained in the source document. So keep that in mind as we go.
That neutrality is just, well, it's vital, because the core tension we are exploring today applies equally across the political spectrum. It strikes at the heart of how our modern legal system operates.
How so?
Well, for decades, these organizations have engaged the absolute best tax-exempt organization counsel money can buy. We are talking about powerhouse firms like Mark Elias's network on the left and Eugene Meyer's network on the right.
The heavy hitters.
Exactly. They hired brilliant attorneys to ensure every component piece of their architecture is technically compliant with current IRS regulations.
Right, the micro rules.
Right. But the author's argument is that technical compliance with a narrowly written agency regulation does not mean you haven't violated the actual overarching law passed by Congress.
When I was reading this section, it immediately made me think of like a workplace analogy to really ground the concept.
Oh, I like analogies. Let's hear it.
It's like reading the employee handbook at your job. And the rule specifically says, no taking office supplies home. So instead of taking a stapler, you take $50 out of the petty cash box to go buy a stapler for your own house.
That is a perfect way to look at it.
Right. And you could sit there and argue with human resources. Well, technically, I didn't take an office supply. I didn't break this specific micro rule. But, you clearly violated the overarching policy against stealing from the company.
7 federal statutes reach the documented dark money architecture. Same elements analysis applies on both sides. Selective enforcement is operationally vulnerable. The framework is the framework.
Yeah, that dynamic is the exact core tension we are exploring today. What you are describing is the profound difference between a regulatory micro rule and the underlying statutory framework.
The big picture versus the fine print.
Right. The statutes are the laws actually passed by the elected representatives in Congress.
Yeah.
And Congress writes those laws broadly to constrain specific types of conduct, like enriching insiders or, intervening in elections using tax-free money.
Right. The big stuff.
Exactly. Then administrative agencies like the IRS are tasked with writing regulations to interpret and implement those laws on a day-to-day basis. And over the decades, the author argues, the agencies have made interpretive choices that continually narrowed the scope of the original statutes.
So they basically watered down the law.
Yeah, effectively. So you end up in a situation where highly sophisticated organizations structure themselves to perfectly comply with the IRS's narrow, loophole-ridden interpretation.
While simultaneously engaging in the exact conduct Congress was trying to prevent in the first place.
They hit the nail on the head.
Which brings up a very obvious question for anyone listening. If the IRS, the federal agency, actively in charge of enforcing the tax code, if they say this behavior is fine, and they give these groups their tax-exempt stamps of approval, who cares?
Right. Why does it matter?
Yeah.
How could a federal prosecutor or like a state attorney general just ignore the IRS's rule book and decide to go after these groups anyway?
This visualization maps a dark money network in action. When isolated nodes illuminate and fade out independently, their individual movements easily evade systematic capture. This creates an immediate operational problem. How does the federal government prosecute a vast, coordinated architecture when the isolated actions of each node do not technically violate specific laws? Moving past civil fines and regulatory infractions requires identifying a federal statute specifically designed to capture integrated, multi-party conduct. That mechanism is Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 371. Specifically, it contains a provision known as the Defraud Clause, which targets those who conspire to defraud the United States or any agency thereof in any manner or for any purpose. This capstone framework is a capable tool for prosecuting coordinated interference, yet it has not been broadly applied to decentralized political architectures. Understanding the mechanics of Section 371 allows for a transition from catching isolated compliance errors to addressing the coordination within integrated political architectures. The boundaries of Section 371 are defined by the controlling 1924 Supreme Court precedent, Hammerschmidt v. United States. The court established 4 conspiracy elements: an agreement, an objective to defraud an agency, dishonest means, and an overt act. Defraud an agency covers any coordinated interference with lawful government functions. Crucially, this requires actual deceit, craft, or trickery, defining the criminal boundary. Organizing, lobbying, and aggressively opposing federal policy is protected political activity. The legal violation triggers only when the network deploys affirmative, dishonest tactics to obstruct the state. This standard ensures the statute only targets coordinated, deceptive interference rather than protected political expression. This framework can be tested against the left-side political architecture by examining the production and payment chain of the Steele dossier. The operation's origin point was the law firm Perkins Coie. The firm coordinated with its clients, the Hillary Clinton campaign and the Democratic National Committee. The funding flowed downstream to the opposition research firm Fusion GPS and was delivered to Christopher Steele. The documented contractual relationships linking these entities satisfied the first statutory requirement, the agreement. The operation's objective was to influence an active counterintelligence investigation inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation, satisfying the second element. This 2022 FEC settlement documents the dishonest means. The campaigns were penalized for misreporting opposition research payments as legal services, mischaracterizing the expense category on federal reports. That deceit continued when unverified claims were used in FISA applications, resulting in the 17 significant errors and omissions identified by the Department of Justice Inspector General. With the false reporting and FISA submissions serving as the overt acts, the documentary record supports each element of the Hammerschmidt standard. Despite the statutory elements being present on the record, the Department of Justice made a specific non-prosecution decision regarding the overarching chain. While peripheral figures faced charges for isolated false statements, the architects of the coordination were not charged with a unified conspiracy. The left-side architecture shows that Section 371 is applicable to modern opposition research, yet federal investigators have historically avoided its pursuit. Testing the framework against the right-side architecture reveals a different limitation. We can examine the pressure campaign aimed at the D.C. Attorney General's investigation into Leonard Leo. The overt acts involved a rapid sequence: congressional letters in October, December subpoena threats, a $250,000 PAC donation a day later, and a 12-state Attorney General intervention letter. This timing across multiple actors establishes the agreement. The objective was to disable the investigative capacity of the D.C. Attorney General's office. However, the D.C. Attorney General is a local entity, not a federal agency. While the pressure campaign involved coordinated overt acts, the required federal jurisdictional threshold is missing. This right-side test case demonstrates the boundary of Section 371. The statute requires a direct attack on a federal function, limiting its application in local political disputes. Stepping back from these specific isolated cases reveals a much broader pattern occurring across modern integrated political operations. Currently, violations involving tax exemptions, campaign finance, and foreign agent reporting are investigated as isolated silos. Investigating these silos individually results in civil fines that, for heavily funded architectures, are often treated as a budgeted expense. The defraud clause provides a framework to bridge these divides. It is designed to look across these boundaries and connect disparate violations. When separate compliance failures are orchestrated together to deceive the government, they meet the Hammerschmidt standard for deceit, craft, and trickery. Deploying Section 371 against these multi-statute patterns offers a path towards capturing architectural coordination. If Section 371 is a viable tool, we must ask why it is not producing indictments against major political networks. The answer lies in a structural mismatch. Dark money architectures are integrated and fast-moving, while federal bureaucracies are often disconnected. Proving a unified conspiracy requires deep coordination. The IRS, the FEC, and federal law enforcement must share tax, campaign, and criminal data. The Department of Justice historically deploys multi-agency resources against individual targets, but it has not organized those resources against decentralized institutional networks. The barrier to accountability is not the text of the law, it is the current lack of federal investigative capacity. The defraud clause carries a significant evidentiary burden and a broad analytical scope within the federal code. To survive the selective prosecution doctrine, this framework must be applied symmetrically to coordinated conduct on both sides of the aisle. The law to address these systems is already written and waiting on the books. Coordinated political architectures rely on exploiting structural silos. Symmetrically deploying Section 371 provides a framework to bridge them.
The answer to that question lies in a massive legal earthquake that occurred in June 2024. The Supreme Court decided a landmark case called Loper Bright Enterprises v. Raimondo.
June 2024. The Supreme Court overruled Chevron deference. Federal courts now read statutes fresh. 40 years of agency narrowing, newly reachable. The doctrinal landscape changed.
Loper Bright.
Yes. And to truly grasp why this entire source document matters, we have to look at the 40 years of administrative law that came before that decision.
We were talking about the famous Chevron doctrine.
We are. Back in 1984, the Supreme Court's Chevron decision established a legal framework that essentially told the lower courts something very specific. It said if a law passed by Congress is even slightly ambiguous and a federal agency has adopted a reasonable interpretation of that law, the courts have to defer to the agency.
So the agency basically got the final word.
Exactly. The agency's interpretation was treated as binding law. For 40 years, agencies could functionally rewrite statutes through regulation, and courts couldn't stop them.
Wow.
But Loper Bright completely overruled that doctrine. That mandatory deference is permanently gone. Now, federal courts must exercise their own independent judgment about the plain text meaning of a statute.
So the IRS doesn't get the final say anymore.
Right. Agency interpretations might get some polite respect if they are well-reasoned, but they are no longer an impenetrable shield.
Okay, so what does this all mean for you, the listener? It means the shield is gone.
Completely gone.
Just because the IRS gave these massive dark money groups a pass for a decade doesn't mean a federal prosecutor today has to agree with the IRS's logic.
Exactly.
An ambitious prosecutor can look at the original law passed by Congress, read the plain text totally fresh, and say, actually, your operational behavior clearly violates the statute, regardless of what that narrow IRS micro-rule said.
And the author emphasizes that this isn't some distant hypothetical scenario. This is the current active state of federal administrative law as of April 2026.
Imagine a federal prosecutor finalizing an airtight indictment against a major conservative operative, someone like Leonard Leo. The statutory violations are documented and the evidence is secure. Once that case reaches the courtroom, the defense team's opening maneuver will likely ignore the facts of the alleged crime entirely. They will instead target the prosecution's selectivity, demanding to know why the Department of Justice bypassed a mirrored target on the left, such as the Wellspring Philanthropic Fund. Ignoring that mirrored left-side target creates a quantifiable vulnerability that threatens the stability of the entire indictment. This risk arises from established Supreme Court precedent, making political symmetry a binding legal reality rather than a mere talking point. The governing framework for this challenge is the United States versus Armstrong Doctrine. The Armstrong Doctrine establishes prosecutorial symmetry as a structural prerequisite for any high-profile political case surviving a motion to dismiss. Prosecutorial discretion, long considered an absolute shield for the DOJ, becomes a significant liability when applied to these mirrored political architectures. Under standard federal law, prosecutors possess broad, generally unreviewable authority to decide who to investigate and who to charge. The Armstrong decision places a hard boundary on that authority by requiring prosecutors to adhere to strict equal protection standards. This boundary was established by the Supreme Court to prevent discriminatory enforcement. To win a selective prosecution claim, a defense team must satisfy a demanding two-pronged legal standard. The text detailing the selective prosecution question outlines these two essential elements. First, the defense must prove a discriminatory effect. This requires showing that similarly situated individuals committed the same acts but were not prosecuted. Second, they must prove a discriminatory purpose, that the decision to ignore those individuals was driven by an impermissible factor, like partisan political affiliation. The Supreme Court designed this two-part test to be difficult for most defendants to pass. In typical street crime or corporate fraud, finding a perfectly similarly situated counterpart is often impossible due to the unique variables of each case. While the Armstrong barrier usually protects the government, the mirrored nature of modern dark money networks provides a procedural tool to dismantle the prosecution's standing. Consider the network surrounding Leonard Leo, CRC Advisors, and the 85 Fund. This right-side architecture faces potential liability under Section 4958, which regulates excess benefit transactions. The analytical walk in Worked Example 1 breaks down how these statutory elements apply to the Leo network's operational conduct. Across the aisle, we find an equivalent counterpart, the Wellspring Philanthropic Fund and its pass-through entity, Matonby Setter. This diagram maps the two structures. On the right, the Leo architecture. On the left, the Wellspring flow. Both utilize identical pathways from 501c3 to 501c4 organizations, creating identical statutory vulnerabilities. The parity persists across other laws. The Perkins-Coie and DNC chain on the left shows Section 371 conspiracy exposure that mirrors coordinated conduct on the right. A defense team does not need to launch an investigation to find these parallels. The record establishing their comparability is already in the public domain. Because the organizational diagrams match, the legal liabilities match. Indicting one of these networks while ignoring the other provides the defense with the exact, similarly situated evidence required to trigger the Armstrong Doctrine. If unilateral prosecution is prone to failure, how does an agency survive an Armstrong motion? Agencies mitigate this risk through symmetric investigation, proving to a judge that they scrutinized both sides with equal rigor. The doctrine requires that parallel investigative resources be deployed against comparable conduct on both sides. In practice, this means matching agent hours, parallel subpoenas, and simultaneous charging reviews for both the left and right side networks. Symmetric investigation does not mandate that both sides must eventually be indicted. One side of an investigation can result in a formal declination to prosecute, provided that choice is based on prosecutorial judgment rather than political bias. These unmade decisions reside within the federal apparatus, primarily at the Department of Justice. The current record, however, shows no evidence of this parallel investigative effort by federal agencies into the political architectures in question. Without a documented trail of parallel investigations, federal attempts to target one side of the dark money apparatus will be procedurally blocked by their own previous inaction. While federal agencies remain largely stationary, enforcement has been active at the state level. In August 2023, District of Columbia Attorney General Brian Schwab launched an investigation into Leonard Leo's network. State attorneys general face a geographic constraint. Their jurisdiction is limited to entities operating within their specific borders. This jurisdictional limit naturally forces state prosecutors into asymmetric targeting, as they can only reach the entities within their reach. This asymmetric approach prompted immediate counterpressure from federal lawmakers like House Judiciary Chairman Jim Jordan. Multiple Oversight Committee chairmen, including James Comer, coordinated efforts to challenge the investigation's legitimacy. Although Schwab is enforcing local charitable trust laws, the logic of selective enforcement allows the political right to challenge the investigation's validity. The District of Columbia investigation demonstrates that state-level targeting without parallel scrutiny of equivalent networks invites immediate, structurally sound retaliation. Taking a macro view, we must examine the entire federal statutory framework designed to regulate political money. This framework includes 7 distinct statutes, from the Internal Revenue Code to the Federal Election Campaign Act. Whether a prosecutor utilizes Section 4958, FARA, FICA, or the conspiracy statute is secondary. None of these laws can be successfully applied to a modern political network if the prosecutor ignores the mirror network on the other side. Calls for bipartisan accountability are often dismissed as idealism. The Armstrong Doctrine moves bipartisan accountability out of the realm of ethics and into the category of tactical necessity. To survive a court challenge, an investigation into one political architecture must be accompanied by an investigation into its mirror. Dismantling a corrupt political architecture requires targeting the entire ecosystem simultaneously. In this legal environment, selective prosecution is a guarantee of defeat.
Loper Bright kicked the door wide open.
It's a whole new ballgame.
It really is. Now that the IRS's regulatory shield has effectively been stripped away, the document walks through the statutory swords a prosecutor might reach for.
Okay, so now that Loper Bright has changed the game, what is the first statutory sword a prosecutor would reach for? It's a section of the tax code anyone who has ever donated to charity will probably recognize. Section 501c3.
The public charity exemption, it is the holy grail of the nonprofit world.
Because it offers an incredibly powerful double tax benefit.
Right. Think about the mechanics of it. First, the organization itself pays 0 federal income tax on the millions of dollars in contributions it receives.
That's massive right there.
And second, the wealthy donor gets to deduct that massive donation from their own personal taxable income. It is heavily subsidized by the American taxpayer.
But Congress didn't just give that extraordinary financial power away for free, did they?
No, absolutely not. There is a strict, non-negotiable trade-off built into the statute itself. In exchange for the double tax benefit, the law imposes an absolute bar on political campaign intervention.
Absolute. Like, no exceptions. The source material really stresses this point.
Yeah, it's very clear.
There is no primary purpose exception where you can say, politics is just a side gig. There is no, we only spend a tiny fraction of our budget exception. If an organization holds that 501c3 status, they cannot participate or intervene in any political campaign, period.
On behalf of or in opposition to any candidate, none. And the structural penalties for violating that absolute bar are layered. And, they're economically devastating.
Let's talk about those penalties.
It begins with an initial 10% excise tax on the political expenditures themselves. And that's accompanied by a 2.5% tax levied directly against the organizational managers who knowingly approved the spending.
Ouch. And if they don't fix it?
If the organization refuses to correct the violation, those taxes escalate to 100% of the expenditure on the organization and 50% on the managers.
Wow. But the financial penalties are just the opening salvo, right?
Well,
there's also the nuclear option.
Oh, yes. The IRS maintains the authority to completely revoke the organization's tax-exempt status, meaning all of that protected revenue suddenly becomes fully taxable.
That would bankrupt most of them.
Likely, yes. And beyond the tax implications, there is a severe criminal component here.
Wait, criminal?
Yes. If an organization actively hides its political campaign activity on its annual IRS Form 990 filings, perhaps by labeling a highly partisan opposition research as, benign voter education, that deceptive conduct potentially triggers 18 U.S.C. Section 1001.
The false statement statute.
Exactly. That is the federal false statement statute, which carries a 5-year felony penalty for lying to the federal government.
So the liability is just massive. Now, the source document takes this 501c3 standard and applies it symmetrically, refusing to let either side of the aisle off the hook.
That's just what makes it such a great analysis.
Right. Let's look at how this plays out, starting with the right-wing architecture. Example A in the analysis is the Federalist Society. They reported about $48 million in assets in 2024. And their stated, on-paper mission is promoting conservative and libertarian legal scholarship.
Right, on paper. But the documentary record tells a much more operational story. The source details how the Federalist Society's actual role, has been the centralized, systematic vetting and promotion of specific candidates for federal judicial nominations.
Across multiple presidential administrations.
Exactly. The author cites prominent legal analysts who note that conservative legal architect Leonard Leo, utilizing this exact structure, was essentially responsible for seating a third of the current justices on the Supreme Court.
A third of the Supreme Court?
Yeah. The organization didn't just host academic debates. They developed formal, actionable lists of judicial candidates, promoted them through targeted programming, and coordinated broader advocacy through a network of sister entities, entities that often share the same mailing addresses and key personnel.
Okay, but wait. I have to push back here to play devil's advocate for a second.
Go for it.
Judges are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. They aren't elected by voters. And the 501c3 statute specifically says you cannot intervene in a political campaign.
Right.
So under a strict reading of the rules, vetting judges wouldn't be intervening in an electoral campaign, right? Technically, they aren't crossing that specific line.
That is the exact technical defense their legal counsel relies on. Under the IRS's current, very narrow interpretive framework, which focuses almost exclusively on people running for elective office, the Federalist Society is technically in the clear.
Right, the micro rule.
But this is where Loper Bright changes the math. We have to look at the underlying statute. The text of 501c3 requires that an organization be operated exclusively for educational or charitable purposes.
Exclusively?
Yes. Back in 1945, the Supreme Court established something called the operational test in a case known as Better Business Bureau v. United States.
What does that test say?
That legal test dictates that a single non-exempt purpose, if it is substantial in nature, destroys the tax exemption completely, no matter how many other legitimate, purely educational activities the organization conducts on the side.
Ah, I see the connection. So, under Loper Bright, a prosecutor today could bypass that narrow IRS regulation, look at the Federalist Society's massive shadow HR operation to seat Supreme Court justices, and argue to a federal judge this isn't just educational scholarship.
Right. This is substantial operational political activity.
It clearly violates the 1945 operational test.
The argument becomes entirely viable again, and the source then points to another right-wing example that pushes the boundary even further, the 85 Fund.
Let's talk about them.
On paper, it is legally registered as a 501c3 charity. However, in February 2020, they legally registered a fictitious name, a DBA, or doing business as in the state of Virginia called the Honest Elections Project.
And they use that alternate fake name to aggressively file legal briefs in courts against mail-in voting right before the 2020 election and to run millions of dollars in paid advertising campaigns.
Yes, they did.
Again, the technical defense is predictable, right? We are just engaging in public education about the procedural rules for voting administration. We aren't naming a specific candidate on the ballot, so we aren't technically intervening in a campaign.
But even under the IRS's own internal rule book, specifically a 2007 ruling regarding the facts and circumstances of an organization's actions, that defense falls apart.
Really? How so?
The IRS is supposed to look at factors like the timing of the activity, the specific issues being identified, and whether the group is coordinating with known political entities.
Which all look absolutely terrible for the 85 Fund in this scenario.
Exactly.
I mean, the timing of their massive ad spend was immediately pre-election. The issue they were hammering mail-in voting was undeniably one of the major dividing lines distinguishing the two presidential candidates in 2020.
Undeniably.
And they heavily coordinated with the broader Republican-aligned legal and political infrastructure.
Right. The operational reality of the 85 Fund points directly to partisan political campaign activity designed to influence an election outcome. It should fundamentally trigger the 501c3 absolute bar. But the administrative agencies simply haven't had the appetite to enforce their own rules.
Wow. But as we promised, this analysis doesn't just stop at the grot, right?
Right.
The author flips the script and demonstrates how the exact same legal vulnerabilities exist in the left's political machinery.
Yes, they do.
Let's look at example C, Democracy Forward. This is a massive 501c3 public charity. In 2023 alone, they reported $42.7 million in revenue.
That's a lot of tax-free money.
Yeah, and they provide the overarching legal and financial framework for a fiscally sponsored project called Federal Workers Against DOGE, or FWAD.
FWAD. This is where the paper trail meets the statutory text. FWAD functions as a coordinated organizing operation specifically targeting federal civil service employees. The source document details a December 2025 strategic call where FWAD leadership explicitly coordinated with sitting members of Congress. Their goal was to instruct federal employees on how to systematically obstruct compliance with the incoming administration's Department of Government Efficiency directives.
They were actively framing executive branch personnel actions as illegal orders that required organized bureaucratic resistance.
Exactly.
But hold on, let me apply the same critical lens here. Isn't organizing federal workers just a standard labor dispute or a disagreement over public policy?
You'd think so, at first glance.
Right. How can opposing an executive branch management directive possibly be legally construed as intervening in a political campaign? FWAD isn't trying to win an election. The election is already over.
Under the IRS's historically narrow definition of a political campaign, you're right, they wouldn't classify it as campaign intervention, but again, under the Loper Bright standard, we return to the 1945 Better Business Bureau operational test.
The single non-exempt purpose rule.
Exactly. FWAD's core function is highly partisan political organizing, aimed at crippling a presidential administration's policy agenda. It is a substantial, non-exempt purpose that operates entirely outside the boundaries of a traditional public charity.
So the enforcement gap isn't because the law passed by Congress is weak. It's just that the referee hasn't blown the whistle in 40 years.
That's a great way to put it.
Why hasn't the IRS revoked their charity status?
It is a profound historical failure to act. The author notes that there is almost no modern enforcement record of the IRS revoking a 501c3 status for partisan organizing that didn't involve a direct electoral campaign.
Wait, really? No modern record?
You have to go all the way back to 1989 to find a classic enforcement case for the operational test. That was the revocation of Bob Jones University's status, and that was over institutional race discrimination policies, not political organizing.
Wow.
The statutory law written by Congress easily reaches FWA's conduct. The agency's historical choice to look the other way is the only thing protecting them.
That's wild. And the source also points out massive vulnerabilities in the left's famous Arabella architecture. You have the New Venture Fund, which holds 501c3 charity status, moving massive grants to the 1630 fund.
We need to unpack how that specific mechanism works because it is the engine of modern dark money.
Let's do it.
The 1630 fund is a 501c4 organization. A 501c4 is designated as a social welfare organization, and unlike a strict charity, it is legally permitted to engage in a certain amount of direct political activity.
Okay, so C3 is strictly no politics. C4 allows some politics.
Right. So what the Arabella network does is use a twinning structure. The tax-deductible money flows into the C3 charity from wealthy donors, and then large grants are transferred to the C4 social welfare arm.
I see where this is going.
By passing the money between these two distinct tax designations, they are effectively attempting to wash the funds, creating a layer of separation before the C4 uses that money to fund highly partisan, pop-up ballot measure campaigns with generic, state-specific names.
It's a regulatory washing machine.
Yes, it is.
But under Loper Bright, a federal court is no longer bound by the IRS's historical choice to ignore how that washing machine operates.
Exactly.
If you look at the timing of the money transfers, the identification of the ballot issues, and the explicit coordination between the two supposedly separate funds, it all suggests prohibited campaign intervention by the upstream charity that collected the tax-free money in the first place.
It completely shatters the illusion of separation.
Okay, so now that we understand the 501c3 vulnerabilities, I have to admit something.
What's that?
As compelling as the operational test is, arguing in front of a judge over whether something is educational scholarship or operational political activity still feels, I don't know, a little bit subjective.
It can be, yeah.
It feels like a gray area where high-priced lawyers could argue in circles for years, defining and redefining words.
Is there a statute in this document that is more black and white? Like a law where a prosecutor could just point to a ledger and say, you cross this exact mathematical line?
There is. And it brings us to Statute 2, IRC Section 4958.
Section 4958. Yes. This is known as the Intermediate Sanctions Framework, and the author identifies it as arguably the most operationally actionable, clear-cut rule in the entire tax-exempt landscape.
Why do they call it an intermediate sanction? That implies there's something more extreme.
Well, the history here is fascinating. Before 1996, the IRS only had one tool in its toolbox to punish a nonprofit organization that paid excessive, unjustifiable compensation to its own founders or insiders.
Let me guess, the nuclear option.
Exactly. Total revocation of their tax-exempt status. But because that penalty essentially destroyed the organization, the IRS was terrified to actually use it, even when investigators found clear evidence of insider self-dealing.
You want to blow up the whole ship just to punish punish a greedy captain.
Right. So Congress stepped in and created Section 4958 as an intermediate ground, a way to surgically punish the specific individuals abusing the money without destroying the charity itself.
So how does it actually work in practice? What specific mechanism of self-dealing does this statute make illegal?
It imposes a strict, unavoidable excise tax on what the law calls an excess benefit transaction. And the elements to prove it are very concrete and rely purely on accounting.
No philosophy, just math.
Just math. It applies whenever a disqualified person, meaning an organizational insider, like a founder, an executive director, a board member, or a major donor who exercises substantial directional influence over the charity, sits on both sides of a financial transaction.
Let me make sure I'm visualizing this correctly. An insider creates a tax-exempt charity and raises millions in tax-free donations.
Yep.
Then, that exact same insider turns around and has the charity sign a massive contract to hire the insider's own private, for-profit LLC.
To provide management services or IP licensing at wildly inflated, uncompetitive rates.
So the insider is basically moving tax-exempt money from their nonprofit left pocket into their for-profit right pocket.
That is the exact mechanism. If tax-exempt assets are paid out to a for-profit entity controlled by an insider, and the economic benefit the insider receives exceeds the fair market value of the services the charity actually received in return.
That's a violation.
That is a clear violation of Section 4958.
And the penalties aren't just a slap on the wrist.
Oh, no.
The source details how this works. There is an immediate 25% excise tax levied directly on the insider who received the inflated payout, plus a 10% tax on the organizational managers who signed off on the contract.
And it gets worse.
Right. If they don't immediately return the money to the charity, the penalty on the insider skyrockets to 200% of the excess benefit.
200%. Furthermore, state attorneys general can utilize this exact same factual ledger to pursue parallel civil charges for charitable trust violations.
Oh, wow.
Because it relies on financial ledgers rather than subjective definitions of politics, it is a highly enforceable, mathematically provable standard.
The reason this is so absolutely crucial to our deep dive today is because this specific statute perfectly targets the core operational structure of these modern dark money groups.
It really does.
Across both the political left and the right, this documentary series shows how the exact same network of operatives are sitting on multiple nonprofit boards, directing tens of millions of tax-exempt dollars into their own private, for-profit consulting and media firms.
The self-dealing isn't a bug in the system. It's the lifeblood of the whole architecture.
Yeah.
The beauty of Section 4958 for a prosecutor is its simplicity. Section 501c3 requires complex legal arguments about whether an activity crossed a philosophical line from educational to political.
Which is hard to prove.
Right. But Section 4958 just asks two questions. Did the same individual exercise directional influence over both the charity dispensing the money and the for-profit company receiving the money? And did they enrich themselves using those tax-exempt assets?
And when the financial documents answer yes to both halves of that quotient, the statute is triggered.
It's all right there in the bank statements.
Just numbers on a page.
It is. The brilliant technical compliance that these organizations rely on, the regulatory micro-rules that let them pass money through donor-advised funds or use fictitious names to hide their activities, none of that convoluted paperwork protects them from Section 4958 if the underlying economic reality is insider self-dealing.
This has been an incredibly eye-opening deep dive into the mechanics of power.
Yeah, it's a lot to process.
It is. And, you know, if you are listening to this and you've ever felt like the modern political system is just an impenetrable, permanent machine of dark money that regular people can't touch, this legal analysis reveals something entirely different.
It shows the cracks.
Exactly. The machine is actually built on a highly fragile, constantly shifting legal foundation. For decades, these massive organizations have been playing a high-stakes game of regulatory Jenga, carefully pulling out blocks and creating loopholes under the IRS's watchful, permitting eye.
But the Supreme Court's Loper Bright decision didn't just pull out another block, it bumped the entire table.
And that leaves us with a truly provocative reality to consider as we wrap up.
Yeah, the author points out that the 501c3 framework currently possesses the largest enforcement gap in the entire federal tax system. But laws ultimately are just words on paper. They rely on human beings to enforce them.
Right, someone has to actually do it.
The statutory framework written by Congress is already there. The text clearly reaches the conduct of these dark money groups. Imagine what happens to the entire American political ecosystem if just one ambitious federal prosecutor or one state attorney general looking to make a name for themselves decides to step into that 40-year enforcement gap.
Just one.
What happens if they utilize these new, untested Loper Bright powers to bypass the IRS and read the law fresh?
Would the whole dark money architecture collapse overnight? Because suddenly it's not just a political debate on cable news anymore. It's a massive, mathematically provable legal liability.
The table has been bumped, the regulatory Jenga tower is swaying, and we might be about to find out what happens when the blocks finally fall. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Keep questioning the structures around you, and we'll see you next time.
7 federal statutes, the same elements analysis, applied symmetrically to both sides of the architecture.
Over the last few years, we've documented massive, highly coordinated political funding networks operating across the country. Billions of dollars flow through these structured channels to influence American elections and policy. This conduct is far removed from any legal gray area, yet the entire system built to monitor it has ground to a halt. The documented actions of these networks meet every statutory element required for federal prosecution. The laws designed to regulate tax-exempt interventions and foreign campaign contributions are already on the books. The enforcement agencies tasked with acting as watchdogs over this system have been systematically drained of their operational capacity. This structural reality creates an accountability vacuum, allowing illegal political networks to operate with total insulation from federal oversight. The first failing safety net is the Federal Election Commission. They serve as the primary civil monitor for money in federal elections, responsible for tracking contributions and enforcing limits. This timeline tracks the FEC's operational status between September 2019 and December 2020. During those 15 months, the Commission lost its quorum, leaving only 28 days where they could legally vote on enforcement matters. That collapse repeated itself in February 2025. Following the removal of Commissioner Ellen Weintraub, the agency was left with only 2 out of its 6 seats filled. Without a quorum, the agency cannot issue formal advisory opinions, assess penalties, or authorize the general counsel to pursue litigation. Complaints simply pile up in the enforcement queue. The agency is functionally dead in the water. While the legal framework reaches the conduct of these dark money architectures, the frontline monitor is structurally unable to enforce it. The second line of defense lies with the IRS Tax-Exempt and Governance Entities Division. Their enforcement capacity is currently crippled by an institutional cultural retreat. This originated with the 2013 controversy involving the IRS handling of Tea Party-aligned applications. Years of subsequent budget cuts and intense congressional scrutiny have left the agency terrified of political backlash. This has resulted in extreme caution toward high-profile tax-exempt enforcement rate for tax-exempt organizations has dropped below 1%. Even new modernization funding is being diverted toward individual taxpayers and large corporations, leaving nonprofit oversight starved for resources. This effectively neuters the IRS, allowing massive dark money architectures to abuse their tax-exempt status without fear of an audit. That leaves the ultimate federal enforcer, the criminal prosecutors at the Department of Justice. Following the Mueller investigation, the DOJ's National Security Division significantly increased its enforcement of the Foreign Agents Registration Act, pursuing more prosecutions in a few years than in the previous 2 decades combined. However, this strategy is laser-focused on high-profile individuals connected to specific foreign governments. Simultaneously, the Public Integrity section is maxed out, with its finite resources dedicated to traditional bribery and honest services fraud cases involving individual office holders. Untangling the layered pass-through funding chains of a modern dark money network requires an investigative depth that no federal unit has yet committed to. The DOJ is fundamentally looking the wrong way, chasing individual targets while fully integrated billion-dollar political networks slip through the cracks. With the federal apparatus paralyzed, state attorneys general remain the only active enforcement venue. They possess independent investigative resources and a higher degree of insulation from federal political cycles. This fallback option is currently being tested. In August 2023, the Washington, D.C. Attorney General opened an investigation into the financial network directed by Leonard Leo. Despite their independence, state AGs face a major geographic constraint. Their jurisdiction is limited strictly to entities registered or operating within their own borders. National funding architectures require multi-state coordination to prosecute effectively, a level of cooperation that is extremely rare in complex tax-exempt cases. Any enforcement attempt must also overcome the selective prosecution doctrine. This legal hurdle requires that investigations be applied symmetrically across both sides of the aisle to survive a challenge in court. The current piecemeal system cannot fix itself. It requires an entirely new, integrated prosecutorial roadmap. In Part 8, we will lay out the blueprint to break this paralysis.
United States versus Armstrong, selective prosecution defense. If you charge one side and decline the other, the case is operationally vulnerable. Symmetric investigation isn't ethics, it's strategy.
Of the 7 federal frameworks that could reach the documented dark money architecture operating in American politics today, this one is the most operationally actionable.
Right.
And here's why no one is using it. Welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Today, we are bringing you directly into, well, basically a prosecutorial grade walkthrough of the federal statute book. We've pulled together a literal mountain of documentary evidence for you.
Oh, yeah. Tons of it.
I mean, tax returns, public records, investigative reports, and the literal text of the federal tax code. Our mission for this deep dive is to look at the biggest financial networks operating in American politics today.
On both the right and the left.
Exactly, both sides. And we're going to measure their conduct against one single, highly specific legal tool, Internal Revenue Code Section 4958.
Right.
And I just find it absolutely fascinating that while everyone, argues endlessly about campaign finance violations and foreign agents.
Yeah, usual talking point.
Right, the usual stuff. But there is this mathematically precise tax law sitting right there in plain sight, designed exactly for this kind of conduct.
It's vital to establish the ground rules for the listener before we even open up these ledges, though.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because this analysis is completely divorced from partisan politics. The law doesn't care about the political objectives of the people involved.
It doesn't care if you're a conservative or a progressive.
Exactly. It only cares about the structure of the transactions.
Right.
So we are committed to absolute symmetry today. We're going to examine massive financial ecosystems on both sides of the political aisle because the conduct is entirely parallel.
Well, it's the exact same blueprint.
Yes. If the factual elements of a transaction fit the requirements of the statute, the law is engaged. Period.
Okay, so let's lay the foundation. The sources focus heavily on this specific section of the tax code, Section 4958. And when you look at the history here, it refers to this law as the intermediate sanction.
Right.
I really want to understand the environment that made this law necessary. I mean, why did Congress have to invent a new sanction back in 1996?
Well, to understand the mechanism of Section 4958, you kind of have to put yourself in the shoes of an IRS auditor prior to 1996.
Okay, I'm an auditor in 1995.
Right. So imagine you're reviewing the books of a massive tax-exempt organization. It could be a charity, a university, or, I don't know, a local soup kitchen.
Sure.
And you discover that a board member has been using the charity's funds to pay themselves an exorbitant, completely unjustifiable salary.
Just skimming off the top.
More than skimming, just looting it. Before 1996, the IRS was structurally paralyzed because they really only had one enforcement mechanism at their disposal.
Just one.
Yeah, revoking the organization's tax-exempt status entirely. It was universally known as the nuclear option.
Wow. So revoking the status, meaning the charity is just effectively destroyed?
Completely dismantled.
Yeah.
But think about the catastrophic collateral damage of that action.
Yeah, I mean, if it's a soup kitchen, the people who need food suffer.
Exactly. If you strip a hospital of its tax-exempt status because one executive is siphoning off funds, you're punishing the patients. You're punishing the entire community.
Right.
The beneficiaries of the charity bear the brunt of the penalty, while the insider, who actually orchestrated the financial abuse,
They just walk away with the cash.
they often just walk away with the money. Because that penalty was so disproportionate and destructive, the IRS almost never used it.
That makes sense. They didn't want to blow up the hospital.
Right. So the practical reality was that a massive amount of financial abuse simply slid under the radar. The agency needed a scalpel, not a nuclear bomb.
Okay, so Congress realizes the regulators are basically trapped. They need a way to punish the bad actor without burning down the building. So we get the 1996 creation of Section 4958.
Exactly.
And reading through the framework, this isn't some like vague guideline. It's a self-dealing statute for public charities, which are 501c organizations, and social welfare organizations, which are 501c4s.
That's right.
And the penalties are hyper-specific. We're talking about a multi-tiered excise tax.
And that mathematical precision of those penalties is what makes the statute such a powerful deterrent. The law shifts the burden entirely away from the organization and places it directly onto the individuals responsible.
So it targets the person writing the checks.
Exactly. If an illegal transaction occurs, the statute imposes an automatic 25% excise tax on the insider who received the money.
Wait, let me make sure I have the mechanics of this right. If an executive improperly pulls, let's say, $1 million out of a charity, they don't just get a slap on the wrist.
No, absolutely not.
They personally owe the IRS $250,000 immediately.
Immediately. And the liability extends further than that. There's an additional 10% tax, which is capped at $20,000 per transaction that is levied on the organization's managers.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this means the board members or executives who knowingly and willfully approve the transaction, they are personally on the hook for facilitating it.
So you can't just look the other way.
Right. But the real teeth of the statute, the enforcement mechanism that actually terrifies compliance officers, is the escalation clause.
The 200% escalation clause, I saw that in the documentation, and frankly, it completely changes the risk calculus.
It alters the entire landscape of the transaction.
Yeah.
If the insider does not, quote, correct the transaction within a defined taxable period.
Which legally means what, exactly?
It legally means they must return the improperly taken money to the organization with interest.
Okay.
If they don't do that, that initial 25% tax skyrockets to 200% of the benefit received.
Wait, 200%. So in my hypothetical, if that executive refuses to give the $1 million back to the charity, their tax bill to the IRS becomes $2 million.
You got it.
It is an intentional design to make the financial risk of self-dealing completely ruinous.
It is designed to aggressively force capital back into the charitable sector. But, to deploy that weapon, regulators have to meet two highly rigid statutory elements.
Right, they have to prove it.
Yes. First, they must identify a disqualified person. Second, they must prove an excess benefit transaction actually took place.
Okay, I want to dig into the first element because disqualified person sounds like a formal title, But the statute seems to cast a much wider net. The text of Section 4958 doesn't just list CEOs or treasurers.
Right, because the functional reality of modern organizations is that the people who hold the actual power rarely hold the official titles.
That's so true.
The architects of this law understood that. Therefore, the statute defines a disqualified person as anyone who, at any time during the 5-year period ending on the date of the transaction, was in a position to exercise substantial influence over the affairs of the organization.
Substantial influence. That's the phrase.
That phrase is the key. It reaches the founder who stepped down but still pulls the strings. It reaches the major donor who dictates strategy.
Or the consultant.
Yes. It reaches the outside consultant whose recommendations are universally rubber-stamped by the board. If you have the operational gravity to direct the organization's actions, the law considers you a disqualified person.
That makes perfect sense. It prevents someone from just hiding behind an LLC or an advisory role while secretly running the show.
Exactly.
Now, let's look at the second element, the excess benefit transaction. The documentation defines this as a scenario where the economic benefit provided by the tax-exempt organization exceeds the value of the consideration received in return.
Right. And consideration is simply the legal term for the goods or services actually provided to the organization. So what did the charity actually get for its money?
Let's build a mechanism to show the listener how this actually looks in practice.
Let's do it.
Imagine a scenario where I have substantial influence over a massive social welfare nonprofit.
Right.
I also happen to own a private for-profit firm. I direct the nonprofit to hire my private firm to run a digital advertising campaign.
Common setup.
Right. The actual work my private firm performs, buying some web ads, writing some copy, has an open market value of, say, $500,000. Any other vendor would charge $500,000.
Sure.
But because I control both sides of the transaction, I have the nonprofit pay my private firm $20 million.
Wow. Okay.
It isn't just about paying a consultant at that point. It's a mechanism for extracting capital from a tax-exempt environment and laundering it into private taxable wealth. That $19.5 million difference between the real value and the invoice price, that is the excess benefit.
The mechanism you just described is the exact operational blueprint we're going to be dissecting today.
Exactly.
The difference between the actual open market value of the services rendered and the inflated price paid out by the nonprofit is the actionable excess benefit. And the terrifying part of your scenario from a regulatory perspective is how thoroughly that exact dynamic mirrors reality.
It's not a thought experiment.
We're not talking about hypotheticals anymore. We are talking about documented, 9-figure fact patterns.
Which brings us to the application of this law. We have the framework, we understand the elements, let's map it onto the first major financial architecture detailed in our sources.
Right. Let's dive in.
The Federal Election Commission lost quorum for 15 months in 2019, lost it again in February 2025. 2 of 6 seats filled, the framework reaches the conduct the agency cannot enforce.
We're starting with the political. Right, specifically the network surrounding Leonard Leo.
To analyze this architecture properly, we have to isolate the specific entities involved.
Okay, who are the players?
The primary tax-exempt organizations operating within this sphere are the 85 Fund, which operates as a 501c3 public charity, and the Concord Fund, which is a 501c4 social welfare organization.
Got it.
There's also a central node known as the Marble Freedom Trust, which is a massive 501c4 entity. Under the definitions of Section 4958, all of these are applicable tax-exempt organizations. The foundation is set.
So the jurisdiction is established. Now we have to apply the first legal test. Is Leonard Leo a disqualified person under the statute? Looking at the public record and the documentation, he doesn't hold the title of CEO at the 85 Fund or the Concord Fund.
He doesn't hold the executive titles at those specific funds, no. But remember, the standard substantial influence over the affairs of the organization.
Right, the functional control.
Exactly. The documentary record provides a robust foundation for that influence. Leonard Leo is a trustee of the Marble Freedom Trust, which serves as a massive funding mechanism. He's a co-chairman of the Federalist Society. But the critical piece of the puzzle is his role as the operational principal of 2 private for-profit firms, CRC Advisors, and BH Group.
But how does owning for-profit firms connect him to the nonprofits? Like, mechanically?
You look at who is actually running the day-to-day operations of the 85 Fund and the Concord Fund. These entities are directed by individuals who are deeply embedded in Leo's professional network.
Can we give an example?
For instance, the president of the Concord Fund, Carrie Severino, was Leo's direct partner in the Judicial Crisis Network.
Oh, wow.
In fact, the Judicial Crisis Network functionally rebranded into the Concord Fund and the 85 Fund back in early 2020. The interconnected personnel, the shared historical lineage, and the directional flow of capital establish a really compelling case that Leo is a person in a position to exercise substantial influence over these funds.
So the statutory element is squarely engaged.
Exactly.
Okay, we have our applicable organizations, we have a disqualified person. Now we hit the math, we have to establish the excess benefit transaction.
And this is where the numbers get huge.
I am looking at the Form 990 tax filings cited in the sources, and the scale of the capital transfer is just staggering. Between 2016 and 2021, those 2 for-profit firms you mentioned, CRC Advisors and BH Group, received roughly $73 million from the nonprofit entities directed by this network.
And if you extrapolate those publicly reported numbers through 2024, the cumulative total surpasses $100 million.
$100 million.
And to put that in perspective, out of that total sum, approximately $55 million was transferred from a single entity, the 85 Fund.
We're talking about tens of millions of dollars flowing out of a tax-exempt charity directly into the private for-profit companies controlled by the individual who exerts substantial influence over the charity.
Right.
I want to push back on the complexity of this, though, because in the world of federal investigations, prosecutors spend years trying to prove malicious intent or unearth, secret emails. But Section 4958 doesn't seem to care about intent at all.
It fundamentally bypasses the entire debate over intent. That's the genius of the 1996 framework. It doesn't ask prosecutors to decipher whether a political strategy was legitimate.
It doesn't care what they're trying to achieve politically.
Right. It doesn't ask if the cause is just. It asks a brutal, objective math question. On the 85 Fund's publicly available IRS Form 990 filings, they classified these tens of millions of dollars in payments as compensation for consulting and advertising services. So under Section 4958, the sole legal question for an investigator is this: did the actual open market value of the consulting and advertising services provided by CRC Advisors and BH Group genuinely equal the $73 million to $100 million that was paid out.
So an investigator just needs to demand the deliverables.
That's it.
Show us the ad buys, show us the strategic memos, show us the invoices. If the actual value of those ad buys and consulting hours on the open market was only, say, $15 million, but you paid out $73 million.
Then the difference between the true value and the payout is an actionable excess benefit transaction. You have a massive multi-million-dollar violation hiding in plain sight on a tax form. And remember the penalty structure we established earlier.
So 25% tax.
The 25% initial tax escalated to 200% if the money isn't returned. The financial exposure for the individuals involved in a transaction of this magnitude is astronomical.
It is an incredibly clean legal standard. But this is where we have to enforce our rule of symmetry for you, the listener. We promised a comprehensive look at the entire system.
Right, because this isn't just a right-wing phenomenon.
No, this kind of financial architecture is not an isolated tactic utilized by one political faction. It's the operating system of modern American influence. Let's look at the exact same statutory elements applied to the philanthropic left.
The parallel is striking, honestly. When we analyze the architecture on the political left, we find the exact same structural vulnerabilities under Section 4-958. We're going to examine the relationship between the Wellspring Philanthropic Fund, which is an enormous tax-exempt organization, and a private entity incorporated as Matan B. Cedar, LLC.
I have to pause on the name of that LLC. The sources translate Matan B. Cedar from Hebrew, and it literally means anonymous gift.
Wellspring Philanthropic Fund, $124.2 million routed through donor-advised pass-throughs to Matan B. Cedar, LLC, Hebrew for anonymous gift. No active federal investigation.
The irony of the incorporation name is palpable.
Very literal.
But our focus has to remain on the structural elements. Let's walk the framework identically. First, the disqualified person. In this instance, the entity receiving the funds is an LLC.
Right, and LLCs are notoriously opaque.
Yes. The core feature of an LLC is that the identities of its principals are often shielded from public view. However, the operational pattern, which is meticulously documented through Wellspring's own Form 990 filings, reveals that Matan B. Cedar is operationally controlled by individuals who exercise substantial directional influence over Wellspring's grant-making process.
So even if the names of the LLC managers are obfuscated, the flow of operations proves the influence. Wellspring directs massive grants to Matan B. Cedar, and Matan B. Cedar simultaneously directs grants to recipient organizations based on Wellspring's advisory input.
Exactly.
The strategic direction is entirely intertwined. The disqualified person element is satisfied.
The operational reality overrides the corporate veil. Now we apply the second element, the transaction itself.
I'm looking at the transaction figures from the Form 990s, and the numbers here actually eclipse the right side example.
They do.
The Wellspring Philanthropic Fund engaged in $124.2 million in transactions with Matan B. Cedar, LLC. Over $124 million transferred from a tax-exempt philanthropic fund to a private, opaque LLC.
The analytical parallel here is what makes this deep dive so critical. We are asking the exact same legal question that we applied to the right-leaning network. In this case, the justification for why a charity is transferring 9 figures to a private LLC is classified on the tax forms as administrative services and anonymous donor fronting.
Let me stop you right there. What is the functional reality of anonymous donor fronting? If I am an investigator looking at a 990, what am I actually looking at?
From a mechanical standpoint, donor fronting is essentially the service of acting as a financial shield.
Okay.
A wealthy donor wants to fund a particular cause but doesn't want their name publicly associated with the recipient organization. The LLC steps in, takes the money, and then passes it along to the final recipient under the LLC's name, absorbing the public attribution.
But Section 4958 demands evaluation of that service. The statute requires us to ask, does the actual market value of these administrative services and the act of shielding a donor's name genuinely equal $124.2 million? Is the sheer act of passing money along quietly worth a 9-figure fee?
That is the crux of the enforcement question. To answer it requires a fact-intensive audit by a regulatory authority. They would have to demand the internal ledgers.
Right, they'd have to see the actual work.
They'd have to evaluate the specific administrative actions Matan B. Cedar performed, determine the open market rate for those administrative actions, and calculate whether the $124.2 million payout constitutes an excess benefit. The legal exposure is identical to the right side example.
Okay, I have a massive logistical question here.
Sure.
I'm trying to picture the day-to-day operations of these networks. Moving $100 million from the 85 fund to CRC advisors, or transferring $124 million from Wellspring to an LLC called Anonymous Gift. I mean, this feels incredibly brazen.
It does.
If an IRS examiner looks at a tax return and sees a single $124 million line item going to a private LLC, that has to trigger an immediate catastrophic audit. How do the architects of these networks move this much capital without setting off every alarm bell in Washington?
Your intuition is entirely correct. A direct transfer of that magnitude would be a massive red flag. And that brings us to the most complex and sophisticated mechanism in this entire architecture, the pass-through intermediaries.
So they aren't just writing direct checks?
They do not write direct checks. They rely on the illusion of complexity. And this is where we have to introduce the listener to a highly specific regulation that completely dismantles that illusion. 26 CFR Section 53.49584A2.
I want to break down how these intermediaries actually function before we get to the regulation. When we talk about pass-throughs, the sources point directly to donor-advised funds, or DOAFs, institutions like Schwab Charitable, Vanguard Charitable, Fidelity Charitable. How does a donor-advised fund actually operate?
A donor-advised fund is essentially a philanthropic bank account. An individual or an entity donates money to the DAF, say Vanguard Charitable.
Okay.
The moment the money enters the DAF, the original donor receives an immediate tax deduction, and Vanguard takes legal ownership of the funds.
So Vanguard owns it now?
Legally, yes. However, the original donor retains advisory privileges. This means the donor can recommend exactly which charities Vanguard should send the money to next.
It's a routing mechanism. The donor gives up legal control but maintains practical direction over the capital.
Exactly.
So returning to the networks, let's map the chains. On the right side, how does the money actually travel from the source to Leonard Leo's for-profit firms?
The routing chain is designed to obscure the ultimate destination. The Marble Freedom Trust initiates the transfer by routing massive sums of capital into the Schwab Charitable Fund.
Okay, that's step one.
Then, Schwab Charitable, acting as the intermediary DAF, routes that exact capital to the 85 fund.
Step two.
Finally, the 85 fund executes the payment to CRC Advisors, the for-profit entity.
So Schwab Charitable is sitting right in the middle of the chain. And what about the left side network? How does Wellspring move the $124 million to Madden B. Setter?
It relies on the exact same structural concept. The Wellspring Philanthropic Fund routes the capital into Vanguard Charitable and Fidelity Charitable. Those massive, universally recognized DAFs then route the capital directly to Matan B. Setter LLC.
The architects of these systems are using the pristine brand reputations of institutions like Vanguard, Fidelity, and Schwab to make the transactions look entirely routine.
Yes, that's exactly the strategy.
I mean, if I'm an investigator spanning a tax return, a payment to Fidelity Charitable looks perfectly innocent. It's a blue-chip financial institution. But here is where the federal regulation you mentioned, 26 CFR Section 53.4958-4 comes into play. What does that regulation actually do to these routing chains?
That regulation is the kryptonite for this entire system. It is known as the Indirect Transaction Regulation. It explicitly states that a transaction that would be illegal under Section 4958 if done directly is still illegal if it's accomplished indirectly through an intermediary.
It pierces the veil. You cannot wash the transaction through a middleman to cleanse it of liability.
Precisely. The regulatory test is incredibly clear. The law states that if an intermediary entity like Schwab or Vanguard in these specific instances has no significant business purpose or exempt purpose of its own in the transaction, it does not insulate the underlying actors from Section 4958 liability.
So because they are just acting as a conduit.
Right. In these routing chains, the DAFs aren't initiating independent charitable projects. They are merely functioning as passive pass-throughs, executing the routing instructions of the donors.
Because they have no independent business purpose in the transaction, the law just ghosts right through them.
The IRS is instructed by this regulation to look right through the intermediary and treat the transaction as if it occurred directly between the originating charity and the disqualified person.
Wow.
The pass-through entities do not make the transaction legal. They simply obscure the audit trail, making it incredibly difficult for journalists or casual observers to follow the money. But once an authority maps the trail, the intermediary regulation snaps the liability right back into place.
Let's pause right there and synthesize what we've uncovered for the listener. The picture is startling.
It really is.
We have a clear, mathematically precise federal law in Section 4958. We have clear statutory elements regarding disqualified persons and excess benefits. We have hundreds of millions of dollars in transfers publicly documented on IRS Form 990s by the organizations themselves.
All in the open.
And we have a specific federal regulation that explicitly cuts through the sophisticated donor-advised fund shell games they use to route the money. The legal X-ray machine is perfectly calibrated.
Right.
So the ultimate question is, why is no one looking at the film? Where is the enforcement?
That is the most profound question of this entire analysis. Despite the clarity of the law and the public availability of the documentation, the reality of the enforcement landscape is a void.
A void.
Yeah, as of April 2026, which is the time frame of our core source material, there is only one active Section 4958 investigation in the public record regarding this entire national dark money architecture.
Out of all the federal agencies, the Department of Justice, the IRS, there's only one active investigation. Who is running it?
It isn't a federal agency. The sole investigation is being run by a local municipal authority, the District of Columbia Attorney General Brian Schwalb.
A local AG.
Yes, he opened an investigation into Leonard Leo's network in August 2023, following a detailed complaint filed by a watchdog group called the Campaign for Accountability.
So the entire weight of enforcing a massive federal tax statute rests on the shoulders of one local attorney general in D.C. How has the political establishment reacted to that investigation?
The reaction has been an unprecedented, highly coordinated counter-pressure campaign designed to crush the investigation before it can even issue findings.
How bad did it get?
The anatomy of this pushback reveals exactly how much is at stake. In October 2023, almost immediately after Schwalb's investigation became public knowledge, he received aggressive letters from federal lawmakers, specifically House Judiciary Chairman Jim Jordan and House Oversight Chairman James Comer.
And what were they demanding?
They demanded that the local attorney general turn over his internal investigative materials to Congress.
I have to push back on the sheer audacity of that. You have federal lawmakers utilizing congressional authority to demand the internal files of an active local law enforcement investigation into a political ally.
Yeah.
That is an extraordinary breach of jurisdictional norms.
And it escalated further. By December 2023, those initial demands had solidified into formal congressional subpoena threats. But the timeline of events surrounding those threats contains a data point that demands attention.
Okay, what happened?
The very next day after the subpoena threat was issued to the D.C. Attorney General, the Concord Fund, which, as we established earlier, is one of the primary Leo-affiliated nonprofits actively under investigation by Schwalb, made a $250,000 contribution to a House GOP leadership PAC.
The very next day.
The exact next day.
$250,000 flows from the target of the investigation to the political leadership threatening the investigator. The timeline is publicly documented in FEC filings. It is staggering.
And the counter-pressure wasn't limited to the federal level. The network mobilized state-level resources as well. By September 2024, 12 Republican state attorneys general signed a highly coordinated letter arguing that the District of Columbia Attorney General lacks the legal jurisdiction to investigate Leonard Leo's network at all.
Let me guess the connective tissue there. Was that coordinated through the Republican Attorneys General Association?
It was. And if you look at the historical funding of that association, the Concord Fund and its predecessor organizations have contributed over $20 million to the Republican Attorneys General Association since 2014.
The ecosystem protects itself. The one individual attempting to utilize this perfectly functional legal tool is being buried in federal subpoena threats and coordinated jurisdictional attacks funded by the very targets he's investigating.
Exactly.
But this glaring reality brings me back to the most obvious missing piece on the board. Where is the Internal Revenue Service? Section 4958 is a federal tax statute. The IRS is the agency explicitly mandated to enforce it. Why are they completely absent from this battlefield?
To understand the paralysis of the Internal Revenue Service, you have to look beyond the tax code and examine institutional psychology. The agency is suffering from a profound bureaucratic trauma that dates back to 2013. You have to recall the controversy during the Obama administration, which is widely referred to as the Lois Lerner era.
Lois Lerner was the IRS official at the center of the storm regarding the scrutiny of conservative nonprofits. I remember the endless congressional hearings. It dominated the news cycle for years.
It wasn't just a news cycle for the IRS, though. It was an existential crisis. The agency was accused of heavily scrutinizing, delaying, and unfairly targeting the tax-exempt applications of Tea Party and conservative-aligned 501c organizations.
Right.
The ensuing political blowback was catastrophic for the agency. Their leadership was dragged before Congress, their internal communications were subpoenaed, and most importantly, their budgets were severely slashed by hostile lawmakers. The institutional hangover from that era dictates their current operational posture.
So they learned to just stay away.
The IRS learned a very clear, very painful lesson. Investigating politically active tax-exempt organizations brings down the wrath of Congress and threatens the survival of the agency.
I understand the historical trauma, but the landscape has changed. The 2022 Inflation Reduction Act injected massive amounts of capital into the IRS. They received billions of dollars explicitly to modernize their systems and beef up enforcement against wealthy tax evaders. Why hasn't that funding translated into Section 4958 enforcement?
It comes down to how the agency leadership is choosing to deploy that capital. In operational terms, the IRS is heavily prioritizing individual taxpayer compliance and auditing massive multinational corporations for complex transfer pricing violations.
So they're playing it safe.
Extremely safe. Those are traditional enforcement avenues. They are deliberately steering clear of the politically volatile tax-exempt sector. The division responsible for this oversight, the Tax-Exempt and Government Entities Division, is effectively staying in the barracks. The legal framework reaches the conduct, but the agency's institutional priorities, driven by an overwhelming fear of triggering another 2013-style political scandal, have placed this massive dark money architecture entirely outside their active enforcement portfolio.
They have the statutory weapon, they have the funding, they simply lack the institutional stomach for the fight.
Which brings us to the ultimate legal and ethical principle at the heart of our analysis today. You established this at the very beginning of our deep dive, the principle of symmetry.
It's the bedrock of the American legal system. The Armstrong selective prosecution doctrine and basic statutory fairness dictate that the law must be applied uniformly.
Right.
If Section 4958 applies to the Leonard Leo network on the political right and the documentary evidence regarding substantial influence and massive financial transfers strongly suggests the statutory elements are met, then it must identically apply to the Wellspring and Matan B. Sater network on the political left. The law cannot be a partisan weapon. You can't audit the architecture on the right while turning a blind eye to the hundreds of millions flowing through anonymous LLCs on the left, or vice versa.
The statutory text demands equal, aggressive application across the board. But the tragic reality of the current landscape is that because of profound institutional paralysis at the federal level, combined with overwhelming coordinated political counterpressure at the state level, a perfectly functional law is being applied to almost no one.
Let's pull all of these threads together and recap the journey for you, the listener, because the sheer scale of what we've covered today is immense.
A lot to process.
We started by examining how Congress explicitly designed Section 4958 in 1996 to solve this exact problem. They created an intermediate sanction with devastating, mathematically precise penalties, a 25% excise tax escalating to 200% to punish insiders who extract wealth from tax-exempt charities.
Yeah.
It isn't a vague, murky law like campaign finance. It bypasses debates about primary purpose or political intent. It asks a brutally simple, objective question: did a charity pay an individual who holds substantial influence more money than their services were actually worth on the open market?
And we observed how flawlessly that exact statutory fact pattern maps onto the documentary evidence of the most powerful financial networks operating in the country today.
On both sides.
On both sides. We traced the flow of tens of millions of dollars to CRC advisors on the right, and over $124 million flowing to an anonymous LLC on the left.
Yeah.
We walked through the specific federal regulation 26 CFR section 53.4958-4 that explicitly prevents these networks from hiding these transactions behind the pristine brand names of donor-advised funds like Vanguard or Schwab. The pass-through intermediaries don't provide legal immunity. The law reaches right through them.
And yet, despite the laws being codified on the books, despite the transactions being publicly reported on their own IRS tax forms, the enforcement landscape is a barren wasteland. The federal authorities are paralyzed by historical trauma, leaving a single, besieged local attorney general to face the full wrath of the political establishment.
I will leave you with the final thought from the analytical framing of our sources, delivered verbatim because it distills the entire reality of this situation perfectly. The framework reaches the conduct. Whether the conduct is reached is a different question.
That distinction is haunting. It brings us right back to the legal X-ray machine. The machine isn't broken, it's plugged in, it's perfectly calibrated, and the picture it takes is crystal clear. The fracture in the system is right there on the screen for anyone with the authority to see.
It's all there in black and white.
The problem isn't the technology or the law. The problem is that the doctors are too terrified to walk into the room and look at the film. Which leaves us with a final provocative thought that I want you to chew on long after this deep dive ends. If the statutory tools to dismantle dark money self-dealing are already written into the code, and the exact mathematical evidence is publicly documented by the organizations themselves on their own tax filings, what does it mean for the foundation of our legal system when enforcement becomes entirely a question of political courage rather than statutory text? If a law is fully functional but nobody in power is brave enough to pull the lever, is it really a law at all?
7 federal statutes, the same elements analysis, applied symmetrically to both sides of the architecture. Hans-Jörg Wyss, Swiss national, up to $280 million into the 1630 fund. The statute bars foreign nationals from elections. The agency carved out ballot measures. Loper Bright reopens that.
So we need to start today by looking at a financial footprint that is just, it's so massive and honestly so structurally profound that it completely rewires how you have to understand modern American elections.
Yeah, it really does. It changes the whole picture.
Right. Because between 2016 and 2024, Hans-Jörg Wyss, who is a Swiss national, by the way, pumped an estimated $245 million to $280 million into this organization called the 1630 Fund.
Which is just an unbelievable amount of capital.
It's staggering. I mean, to put that into perspective for you listening, that is over $250 million originating from a foreign national just entering the American political ecosystem.
Right. And the origin is one thing, but the destination is what makes this so legally fascinating.
Exactly. Because the documentary evidence shows that the 1630 Fund subsequently took more than $130 million of those resources and deployed them directly into ballot measures across, I think it was 26 different states.
Yeah, 26 states. And when you're moving hundreds of millions of dollars across more than half the country to, influence the outcomes of state-level ballot measures, you're fundamentally shaping the legal and constitutional landscape of those places.
Right.
But, the sheer volume of the money it's actually secondary to the glaring legal paradox it creates.
Right, the paradox. Because anyone listening right now who has even like a passing familiarity with campaign finance law knows there's this massive, supposedly impenetrable wall built into the federal statute book.
Oh, absolutely.
The law explicitly states that foreign nationals cannot fund elections in the United States, period. It's not a gray area. It's basically a bedrock principle of American sovereignty.
It's page 1 of the rule book.
Right. Yet the Federal Election Commission, the FEC, the actual agency tasked with enforcing these laws, has effectively looked at this $250 million influx and concluded, well, ballot measures don't technically count as elections.
Which sounds completely counterintuitive to most people.
It really does. So we have this massive contradiction between the plain text of the law and the referee's interpretation of it. And our mission for this deep dive is to unpack this. We want to figure out how this specific ballot measure loophole was built, how it operates mechanically, and crucially, why a massive Supreme Court ruling from 2024 might suddenly bring this entire 35-year-old architecture just crashing down.
And the timing of this deep dive is so critical because for decades, this loophole wasn't just some legal theory, right? It was the operational reality that these massive political networks relied upon.
Yeah.
But the legal ground beneath that agency interpretation has fundamentally shifted. I mean, we're moving out of an era where agency memos were the final word and into an era where the raw text of the statute reigns supreme.
Which is huge. But before we open up that statute book, I just want to make a really vital note for you listening. This deep dive requires us to explore highly sophisticated, politically charged financial architectures.
Very charged.
Yeah. So we're going to examine mechanisms deployed by left-leaning organizations like the 1630 Fund, and then later we are going to apply the exact same rigorous legal framework to right-leaning architectures like the Charles Koch network's pass-throughs.
Symmetrical application is the only way to actually understand the mechanics here.
Exactly. Our goal here is never to endorse a viewpoint or, play favorites or engage in political punditry. This is a purely impartial prosecutorial grade walk through the documentary evidence and the statutory rulebook. We are just looking at the machinery.
Just the machinery.
Right. So let's look at the foundational law. We are dealing with the Federal Election Campaign Act, or FECA. What does the text actually say about foreign money?
So the core provision we really need to examine is 52 U.S.C. section 30121. This is the statute that establishes the foreign national contribution bar.
Okay, section 30121.
Right. And if you read the plain text passed by Congress, it says, and I'll quote it directly here, "It shall be unlawful for a foreign national, directly or indirectly, to make a contribution or donation of money or other thing of value, or to make an express or implied promise to make a contribution or donation in connection with a federal, state, or local election."
Okay, wait. In connection with a federal, state, or local election? That geographic reach strikes me as highly unusual, doesn't it?
It is extremely unusual.
Because usually when we talk about federal campaign finance laws, like, how much you can donate to a candidate or what disclosures a PAC has to file those rules, only apply to federal races, like the Senate or the presidency.
Right. Generally, Congress leaves the regulation of a mayoral race in Ohio or a state Senate race in Arizona completely up to those individual states.
But not here.
Not here. FECA is, by and large, a statute concerned with federal candidates. But Section 30121 is one of these rare explicit exceptions where Congress extended its jurisdictional reach all the way down the ballot.
All the way to the local level.
Exactly. Because the legislative intent was clear. The threat of foreign influence isn't just isolated to the presidency or the Senate. A foreign entity pouring money into a local utility board election or a state governor's race poses the exact same fundamental threat to sovereign self-governance.
That makes sense.
So they created a blanket, categorical prohibition, federal, state, or local. There is no geographic safe harbor for foreign political spending.
Okay, and just to be completely precise here, let's define the term foreign national based on the statute, because that's under 52 U.S.C. Section 611B. Right?
Yes, Section 611B. And the statute defines foreign national quite broadly. It encompasses foreign governments, obviously, foreign political parties, and foreign corporations.
Right.
But on an individual level, it means any person who is not a U.S. citizen and is not a lawful permanent resident.
Meaning you don't have a green card.
Exactly. If you do not hold citizenship or a green card, you are a foreign national. Full stop. And Hans-Jörg Wyss is a Swiss national. He does not fall into those exempted categories.
So, objectively, legally, he fits the statutory definition.
Indisputably.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Because if I'm playing the role of a federal judge reading this text for the first time, I'm looking at a Swiss national whose funds are undeniably flowing into an entity that then spends $130 million on state ballot measures.
Right.
And the statute says, plain as day, no foreign national can make a contribution directly or indirectly in connection with a state or local election.
Which seems pretty open and shut.
Yeah. I mean, a ballot measure is literally voted on at a polling place on election day alongside candidate races. You go into the booth, you fill in the bubble next to a candidate, and then you fill in the bubble next to Proposition 12 or whatever.
Exactly.
How on earth can anyone argue that funding a ballot measure campaign isn't spending money, quote, in connection with an election? The plain meaning of the word election surely encompasses the entire ballot. Right?
Well, and that is the exact tension that keeps election lawyers awake at night. Because if you isolate the statute and just read it in a vacuum, your conclusion is entirely logical. The text is absolute.
Right.
It does not say in connection with a candidate election. It just says election.
Exactly.
But, and here's the catch, the mechanism of campaign finance law doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in a highly regulated administrative state. The debate here doesn't originate from the text itself, but from how the regulatory referee, the Federal Election Commission, interpreted that text decades ago.
Oh, I see. So it's like having a really clear law on the books that says, I don't know, no unauthorized data collection. But then the agency in charge of enforcing it issues a memo saying, well, metadata doesn't actually count as data.
That's a perfect analogy.
The law itself didn't change, but the enforcement reality did. So how exactly did the FEC justify carving ballot measures out of the word election?
To understand the mechanics of this carve-out, we have to travel back to 1989, specifically to an FEC document known as Advisory Opinion 1989-32.
Okay, an advisory opinion. What exactly is that?
So the advisory opinion process is essentially a mechanism where political actors can ask the FEC for permission or clarification before they engage in a specific activity. It acts as a preemptive legal shield.
So you ask before you spend the money.
Right. You say, hey, we want to do X. Is that legal?
Yeah.
And if they say yes, you're protected. So in 1989, the agency was asked to interpret this broad statutory language regarding foreign nationals. And the FEC commissioners developed a very specific rationale based on what they believed Congress intended, rather than just what Congress actually wrote.
That sounds like a really dangerous game. Guessing intent over reading text, what was their logic?
The FEC reasoned that the entire architecture of the Federal Election Campaign Act was principally designed to prevent corruption or the appearance of corruption regarding American office holders, meaning candidates. They argued that the core historical threat Congress was trying to neutralize was a foreign entity buying influence over a human being who would eventually wield state power. A senator who votes on treaties or a governor who signs trade deals.
So their argument is that an issue can't be corrupted in the same way a person can.
Precisely.
Like a ballot measure, say it's a constitutional amendment to raise the minimum wage, or change tax brackets is a policy outcome. It doesn't hold office, it can't owe you a favor.
Exactly. Because ballot measures do not involve the selection of candidates, the FEC concluded that campaigns for or against ballot measures fall entirely outside the scope of the Section 32121 prohibition.
Wow.
Yeah, they effectively read an invisible word into the statute. They interpreted election to mean exclusively candidate election.
But wait, if Congress explicitly wanted this law to only apply to candidate elections, they know how to write the word candidate. I mean, they use that word dozens of times elsewhere in FECA,
Well,
right?
everywhere, all over the statute.
So the fact that they omitted it here seems like a deliberate choice to make the ban absolute. Surely the FEC didn't just invent this distinction out of thin air.
Well, they weren't just guessing completely in the dark. The FEC was leaning heavily on broader Supreme Court jurisprudence from the 1970s, specifically cases like Buckley v. Vallejo.
Ah, Buckley.
Right, which heavily distinguished between contributions to candidates, which the court said carry a high risk of quid pro quo corruption, and independent spending on issues, which the courts viewed as pure protected speech under the First Amendment.
I see.
The FEC essentially imported that candidate versus issue distinction into the foreign national bar. And while you can certainly debate the statutory purity of that move, in many lawyers, do we have to look at the operational reality it created? Because once that advisory opinion was issued in 1989, it became the operational law of the land.
And that operational reality is the exact architecture that the 1630 Fund and Hans-Jürg are utilizing.
Exactly.
They aren't going rogue. They aren't ignoring the law. They are operating completely within the boundaries drawn by the referee. They looked at the 1989 rulebook, saw the giant loophole labeled ballot measures, and just drove hundreds of millions of dollars right through it.
And that is a critical point for anyone trying to understand the mechanics of dark money. The vast majority of these massive financial deployments are not blatant, mustache-twirling crimes.
Right. It's not envelopes of cash in a parking garage.
Not at all. They are sophisticated exercises in administrative compliance. Operations like the 1630 Fund hire armies of the absolute best election lawyers in the country to ensure that every single dollar WISE donates is firewalled and deployed strictly into the issue advocacy side of the ledger.
Because as long as they do that, they're safe.
Right. As long as they're funding ballot measures, they possess an ironclad legal shield provided by the FEC itself.
But I mean, how ironclad is it really in practice? Because we know from the source material that the 1630 Fund doesn't just operate under one giant banner, right? They use state-specific pop-up names. They create localized projects to push specific measures. In the messy reality of a political campaign, what happens if one of these ballot measure pop-ups accidentally coordinates with a candidate who also happens to support that same measure? Doesn't the line between issue advocacy and candidate support blur incredibly fast?
Oh, it blurs instantly. And that is the secondary structural vulnerability in this entire system. Even under the FEC's incredibly narrow 1989 carve-out, coordination with a candidate fundamentally alters the legal chemistry of the money.
How so?
Well, if a ballot measure committee funded by foreign money begins, say, sharing internal polling data with a gubernatorial candidate, or if they align their television ad buys with a Senate campaign strategy.
So they're working together.
Right. The moment that happens, that spending ceases to be independent issue advocacy. Under FECA, coordinated spending legally transforms into an in-kind contribution to the candidate.
And an in-kind contribution is treated exactly the same under the law as handing the candidate a giant novelty check.
Exactly the same. Yeah. And the moment that money is classified as a contribution to a candidate, that 1989 ballot measure shield evaporates entirely.
Oh.
The foreign national bar of Section 30121 slams shut. So, for a sophisticated entity relying on foreign capital, the internal compliance mechanisms have to be completely flawless.
You have to build a wall.
A massive wall. They have to maintain a hermetic seal between their ballot measure operatives and any candidate campaigns. A single rogue consultant sharing a strategy memo across that firewall could, theoretically, expose the entire multi-million-dollar operation to federal prosecution for violating the foreign national ban.
That's incredibly risky. But still, for 35 years, this 1989 agency interpretation was the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card. If you were a federal prosecutor looking at foreign money and state ballot measures, you read the FEC's memo, realized your hands were tied by the agency's interpretation, and you just closed the file.
That was the reality, yes.
But, and this is where the story completely flips, this brings us to the most massive jurisprudential shift of our lifetime. A legal earthquake that hit in June of 2024 and fundamentally altered the balance of power in Washington. Let's talk about the Loper Bright decision and the death of Chevron deference.
Right. To really understand why the Supreme Court's ruling in Loper Bright Enterprises v. Raimondo is such an earthquake, we first have to explain the bedrock it shattered.
Right, Chevron.
Exactly. For exactly 40 years, dating back to a landmark 1984 case, the entire federal judiciary operated under a doctrine known as Chevron deference.
And Chevron essentially forced judges to bow to bureaucrats, right?
In operational terms, yes. The Chevron doctrine was a two-step framework. First, a judge would look at a statute. If the law was perfectly clear, the text ruled.
Okay, step one is easy.
But if the statute was ambiguous, or if it contained a gap that Congress hadn't explicitly filled, the judge moved to step two. And at step two, if the federal agency tasked with enforcing that law had adopted a, quote, reasonable interpretation of the ambiguity, the judge was legally bound to defer to the agency.
Bound to defer.
Yes. Even if the judge thought there was a much better interpretation out there, as long as the agency's reading wasn't totally irrational, the agency won.
So going back to our statute, a judge looks at the phrase federal, state, or local election. They might think, well, to me, a ballot measure is obviously an election. But under Chevron, the FEC steps in and says, actually, we think it only means candidate elections. And we wrote a memo in 1989 explaining why.
And under Chevron, the judge would say, well, I disagree, but your reading isn't patently absurd based on the legislative histories, so my hands are tied.
They just have to swallow the FEC's interpretation.
Exactly. That is exactly how the administrative state amassed such immense power over 4 decades. Chevron created an environment where agencies, not judges, were effectively writing the operational contours of the law.
Right.
But Loper Bright completely explicitly overruled Chevron. The Supreme Court declared that this system of binding deference violated the Administrative Procedure Act and the fundamental role of the judiciary. The era of mandatory deference is dead.
Wow.
Under the new post-2024 reality, federal courts must exercise their own independent judgment to determine what a statute actually means.
So what is the new mechanism? If an agency like the FEC issues an advisory opinion today, does a judge just, ignore it entirely?
Not ignore, no.
Yeah.
But they weigh it very differently. We have shifted from binding deference to what is known as Skidmore weight.
Skidmore weight.
Yeah, Skidmore is a framework of persuasion, not command. If an agency's interpretation is incredibly thorough, historically consistent, and logically sound, a judge might find it highly persuasive and adopt it.
So the agency is treated more like a highly specialized expert witness.
That's a great way to put it. But the crucial difference is that the court is no longer forced to agree. The ultimate authority to say what the law means rests entirely with the judge.
This is a monumental paradigm shift. Let's apply this directly to Hans-Jörg Wyss and the 1630 Fund.
Hans-Jörg Wyss is a Swiss citizen. Under American law, that makes him a foreign national. Since 2016, Wyss has directed between $245 and $280 million into the American political system, routing the capital through a domestic conduit called the 1630 Fund. That network then deployed over $130 million directly into state-level ballot measures across 26 states. Federal law strictly prohibits foreign nationals from contributing money to American elections, yet this operation functions openly. It relies on an agency interpretation that argues ballot measures do not legally count as elections. To see how this contradiction survives, we need to match the documented financial conduct strictly against the statutory text, and look at exactly why a recent Supreme Court ruling threatens to tear down the network's legal shield. We are going to evaluate this like a federal prosecutor during a charging review session. We take the documented conduct and map it strictly against the elements of the law. No ideological framing. This document shows the Federal Election Campaign Act, specifically Section 30121, which governs foreign political spending. The first element is the definition of a foreign national. As a Swiss citizen, our donor perfectly matches the criteria. The second element is the geographic scope. The statute explicitly bans contributions in connection with a federal, state, or local election. When citizens in a state go to the polls to vote on a ballot measure, they are participating in a state or local election. The text of Section 30121 contains no carve-outs. There is no exception written into the law for issue advocacy or ballot initiatives. Applying the plain text of the law, deploying foreign capital into state ballot measures meets the exact elements of a federal offense. The network successfully avoids prosecution through an obscure piece of agency guidance used to override that plain text. This is Federal Election Commission Advisory Opinion 1989-32. In this document, the agency reasoned that the original purpose of the foreign funding ban was to prevent foreign influence over the selection of American officeholders. Because a ballot measure does not feature a human candidate, the FEC decided that ballot measure campaigns are entirely exempt from the statute. The agency functionally edited the statute, inserting words that Congress never actually wrote. For 35 years, that specific agency interpretation has served as the single load-bearing legal defense, allowing hundreds of millions in foreign capital to flow into domestic campaigns. Courts permitted the FEC to rewrite the statute because of a 40-year-old administrative law doctrine known as Chevron deference. Under Chevron, federal judges were required to defer to a federal agency's interpretation of an ambiguous law, even if the judge believed the agency's reading was incorrect. That entire framework collapsed in June 2024 when the Supreme Court issued its ruling in Loper Bright Enterprises v. Raimondo. The court ruled that Chevron deference is dead. Federal courts must now exercise their own independent judgment to determine what a statute actually means. Applying Loper Bright to the 1630 Fund strips away the agency carve-out, leaving only the strict original statutory text. Federal prosecutors evaluating this conduct today are no longer bound by the FEC's 1989 advisory opinion. The architecture's primary legal shield has vanished. If a case is brought today, a judge could read the statute fresh and determine the funding operation violates federal law. This vulnerability applies symmetrically across the political spectrum. The exact same statutory threat applies to the dark money architecture built by the Charles Koch network. Their corresponding conduit is the Stand Together C4 Fund, a social welfare organization with 0 employees that took in $630 million during the 2024 cycle and passed $350 million of it straight to Americans for Prosperity Action. This structure engages a different part of the Federal Election Campaign Act, the earmarking framework under Section 30116A8. The legal test is straightforward. If original donors direct an intermediary pass-through entity to fund specific downstream targets, those funds legally count as direct limited contributions. If investigators prove the original donors dictated where the money went, those massive grants to field operations instantly become severe campaign finance violations. Both major political architectures rely on exploiting regulatory ambiguities through complex pass-throughs. Following the Loper Bright decision, both networks are now equally exposed to a strict, plain-text reading of the law. But identifying a statutory vulnerability only matters if an agency is capable of enforcing the statute. The sole federal agency tasked with civil enforcement of these campaign finance laws is the Federal Election Commission. The commission requires a minimum number of voting members to function, and it has repeatedly failed to maintain that legal quorum. The agency lost its quorum during the lost years, from September 2019 to December 2020, and suffered a second ongoing collapse beginning in February 2025. Without a quorum, the agency is paralyzed. It is legally barred from issuing advisory opinions, making enforcement determinations, or assessing civil penalties. Severe complaints pile up indefinitely in an enforcement queue that never moves. The agency literally cannot take action against violators. This systemic breakdown provides a reliable safe harbor for the pass-through architectures on both the left and the right. The Supreme Court has stripped away the legal armor protecting these dark money machines. But until the Federal Election Commission is structurally repaired, the architectures will continue to operate with functional impunity.
Because courts no longer have to defer to the FEC's 1989 carve-out, federal prosecutors and judges can now look at 52 U.S.C. Section 30121 completely fresh.
Yes, completely fresh.
They aren't burdened by 35 years of administrative baggage.
Precisely. Just imagine a federal prosecutor initiating a charging review session tomorrow. They look at WIS's foreign funding flowing into state ballot measures. They open the statute book. They read the absolute geographic blanket ban in connection with a federal, state, or local election. Without the chains of Chevron holding them back, that prosecutor could easily conclude that the FEC simply got it wrong in 1989. They could decide that the text contains no candidate versus issue distinction whatsoever, and that funding a ballot measure absolutely, legally triggers the foreign national bar.
You know, it's fascinating because the law itself, the actual words passed by Congress and signed by the president, didn't change by a single comma.
Not a single comma.
The text is identical to what it was in 1980, but the protective shield surrounding it has just evaporated. A federal judge today has the independent authority to say, I don't care what the FEC memo from 1989 says. I can read the English language. A ballot measure is an election, and foreign money is strictly prohibited.
Exactly.
So what does this mean for the operational reality of these massive political funds?
It means that decades of established, relied-upon architecture in the dark money space is suddenly exposed to a level of legal peril that simply did not exist prior to June 2024.
That must be terrifying for them.
Oh, general counsels for these organizations are having to recalculate their risk matrices from scratch right now. An interpretation they viewed as an impenetrable shield for 35 years is now just a persuasive argument they have to try and win in front of an independent judge.
Now, I promised at the beginning of this deep dive that we were going to apply this exact same rigorous prosecutorial framework symmetrically.
And we must.
Right, because the statutory rulebook does not care about political ideology. A legal vulnerability on the left is structurally identical to a legal vulnerability on the right. So let's take that same legal microscope and examine the right-wing parallel. We need to look at the Charles Koch network, specifically a fascinating entity called the Stand Together C4 Fund.
Symmetrical application is absolutely essential to understanding the systemic nature of these loopholes. While the left-leaning 1630 fund utilizes the ballot measure carve-out to process foreign funds, the right-leaning Stand Together architecture relies on a completely different but equally complex statutory mechanism.
So our source material documents that the Stand Together C4 Fund is structured as a 501c4 social welfare organization. And I want to pause here just to explain why that specific IRS designation matters so much in modern politics. Why not just form a regular political action committee, like a normal PAC?
The defining feature of a 501c4 organization in the political context is donor anonymity.
Ah, the dark money.
Exactly. If you donate to a traditional political committee, your name, your address, your employer, and your donation amount are all disclosed to the FEC, and they're available on a public database for anyone to see.
Total transparency.
Right. But 501c4 social welfare organizations are not legally required to disclose their donors to the public. They are the primary vehicles for what we call dark money. As long as their primary activity, meaning more than 50% of their overall spending, is dedicated to non-political social welfare, they can spend the rest on politics without ever revealing who actually wrote the checks.
Okay, so Stand Together is a dark money C4. But the most staggering detail from the documentary record isn't just the tax status, it's the operational structure of this thing. The Stand Together C4 Fund has literally 0 employees.
0.
None. Yet, despite having no staff to answer the phones or write emails, it served as a massive $630 million pass-through during the 2024 election cycle.
It's incredible. And we have to follow the trajectory of that capital to understand the legal vulnerability here. According to the records, of that $630 million, a massive $350 million tranche was routed directly to Americans for Prosperity, or AFP.
Okay.
And another $330 million, representing a mix of cash and services, was routed to a super PAC called AFP Action, passed through yet another entity, the Stand Together Chamber of Commerce.
Wait, a 0-employee entity processing over $500 million? Mechanically, how does that even happen? How does an organization with no staff actually move that much money?
Mechanically, a 0-employee pass-through is little more than a corporate shell and a bank account.
Literally just an account.
That's it. It is usually managed by an external law firm or an accounting firm. It has a board of directors that meets periodically to sign resolutions authorizing wire transfers. The funds come in from anonymous megadonors, sit in the account momentarily, and are then immediately wired out to the operational entities like AFP.
The ones that actually hire the staff, run the ads, and knock on the doors. It's a massive financial hose. So if the WIS architecture triggers the foreign national bar we talked about earlier, what specific part of the federal statute book does the zero-employee pass-through trigger?
This architecture engages the earmarking framework of FECA, which is codified at 52 U.S.C. Section 30116A8.
Earmarking. We hear that term a lot in politics regarding congressional budgets, like pork barrel spending, but what does it mean in campaign finance?
In campaign finance, the earmarking statute is specifically designed to prevent donors from using middlemen to bypass contribution limits or to scrub their identities. The law explicitly states that contributions which are earmarked or otherwise directed through an intermediary or conduit to a candidate must be treated legally as direct contributions from the original donor to the final recipient.
Let me make sure I'm getting this. So if I am legally only allowed to give, say, 3 Yokos and $300 to a candidate, I can't just give $10,000 to my friend and tell him to donate it to the candidate in his name.
Exactly. That would be illegal.
The law collapses the middleman and traces the intent back to me.
Precisely. The intermediary is legally transparent. And this concept applies not just to hard contribution limits, but to disclosure as well. You cannot launder the source of political money by routing it through a series of shell companies, if the original intent was always to fund a specific political end user.
Okay, so apply that statutory framework to the stand-together architecture. We have mega donors writing massive checks to a 501c with 0 employees, which then immediately wires hundreds of millions of dollars to AFP and AFP Action.
The substantive legal question that a prosecutor or a regulator must ask here is this. Did the original megadonors who gave to the Stand Together C4 fund direct, or even impliedly direct, that 0 employee pass through to send those specific funds to downstream recipients like AFP Action?
Because if they did, that's earmarking.
Right. And when an entity has absolutely no employees and conducts no independent programmatic activity of its own, it is the absolute prototypical definition of a conduit. It exists solely to move money.
I mean, if it has no staff to come up with its own ideas, how can it make independent decisions about where the money goes? It's just fulfilling orders. Right.
That is the exact vulnerability. If the government can prove that the donors directed the funds, even through implied understandings, or, say, pitch decks that promised the money would reach AFP, or just historical patterns of coordinated giving, then the earmarking framework is triggered.
And what happens then?
The dark money shield vanishes. The original donors would be exposed, and the entire transfer would be subject to strict federal reporting requirements.
Here is what is so crucial for you to realize as you listen to this. A pass-through is a pass-through. The investigative depth required to prove that a donor impliedly directed funds is the exact same heavy lifting on the right as it is on the left.
Exactly the same.
To crack the stand-together architecture, a prosecutor has to subpoena internal memos, look at slide decks shown at donor retreats, and depose the lawyers who manage those 0 employee bank accounts. It requires proving intent and really tracing the mechanics of the money.
Which is incredibly labor-intensive work for any agency.
It is. And that requirement brings us to the missing piece of this entire puzzle. Because right now you might be thinking, wait, the statutes are clear, foreign money is banned, earmarking through conduits is illegal, and the Supreme Court just empowered judges to enforce the law without deferring to these narrow agency carve-outs. So why isn't anyone in handcuffs?
It's the million-dollar question. Or I suppose the billion-dollar question.
Right. Why are these multi-million-dollar architectures thriving in broad daylight?
The answer to that question requires us to step away from the text of the law itself and look at the physical reality of the agency tasked with enforcing it.
Yeah.
Because a law is only as powerful as the ticket writer tasked with policing it.
Yeah.
And the Federal Election Commission holds a very unique position in the American legal system. It is the only agency with civil enforcement authority over FECA.
They hold the exclusive monopoly on civil campaign finance enforcement. If the FEC doesn't act, nobody acts, which makes the documentary evidence regarding the, quote, loss cycle so completely staggering.
Oh, the loss cycle is unprecedented.
From September 1st, 2019 through December 9, 2020, the FEC suffered a total structural quorum loss.
Total loss.
Can you explain what that actually means?
Yes. The structural design of the FEC is critical here. Congress purposefully designed the agency to be prone to gridlock. It has 6 commissioners, traditionally split 3-3 between Republicans and Democrats, to ensure that the ruling party can't just use the agency as a weapon against the minority.
Which makes sense in theory.
In theory, yes. But the law also requires a minimum of 4 commissioners a quorum to take any official binding action.
Okay, so what physically happens when the terms of enough commissioners expire or they resign and the Senate just doesn't confirm replacements? What does a quorum loss mean for the day-to-day operation of the agency?
It means total, debilitating paralysis. Without 4 sitting commissioners, the agency is legally lobotomized. The staff can still turn on the lights in the building, they can still receive disclosure reports and upload them to the public website, but they cannot function as a law enforcement body.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning they cannot meet in executive session. They cannot vote to open a preliminary investigation into an earmarking scheme. They cannot issue a single subpoena for a bank record. And they absolutely cannot levy civil fines or penalties.
Wow. So from September 2019 to December 2020, a span of 15 months that precisely covers the most intense, highly funded stretch of a presidential election cycle, the only civil enforcement mechanism for federal campaign finance law in the United States was entirely turned off.
Entirely turned off. And the operational consequences of that blackout are profound. When watchdog groups or opposed political parties filed complaints during that time saying, hey, look at this foreign money or look at this zero-employee pass-through, those complaints didn't trigger investigations.
Where did they go?
They went into a literal pile. They accumulated in a massive, insurmountable backlog.
And here is where the math becomes deadly for enforcement, right? Because FECA violations operate on a strict 5-year statute of limitations.
That's right, 5 years.
So if the agency is paralyzed for 15 months and then spends the next 2 years just trying to dig out of the backlog of thousands of complaints, what happens?
The clock simply runs out. The statute of limitations expires while the complaint is just sitting on a desk somewhere waiting for a quorum vote. The conduct goes entirely unchecked, not because it was legal, but because the enforcement apparatus timed out.
It just expired.
Exactly. If we look at the systemic reality of American campaign finance, this enforcement gap is the most operationally severe vulnerability of all. You can have the strictest, most aggressively plain-text statutes on the books. You can have a Supreme Court decision like Loper Bright that liberates judges to apply the law with teeth. But if the agency that acts as the front door to the entire civil enforcement system lacks the personnel to legally convene a meeting, the sophisticated architectures just operate with total impunity.
It's the ultimate regulatory paradox. We have built this incredibly complex legal maze, but we forgot to hire a minotaur.
That's exactly it.
The architects of these billion-dollar funds know exactly how to map the gap between the text of the law and the reality of its enforcement. So let's synthesize this incredibly complex journey we've been on.
Okay.
We began by uncovering how $250 million of foreign capital legally integrated into American state constitutions through a 35-year-old administrative loophole. We analyzed the statutory text to see how a plain reading contradicts the agency's carve-out.
We then explored the jurisprudential earthquake of Loper Bright, detailing how the death of Chevron deference removes the mandatory legal shield that protected these operations for decades, exposing them to fresh, independent judicial scrutiny.
Right. And then we took that identical legal framework and applied it symmetrically to the right, unpacking the mechanics of zero-employee 501c pass-throughs and the strict statutory boundaries of the earmarking laws.
And finally, we confronted the stark physical reality of the enforcement gap, analyzing how the FEC's structural gridlock and historical quorum losses ensure that even the most blatant statutory violations often expire in a backlog, rather than ending in a courtroom.
It is a system where compliance is dictated less by the strict wording of the statute and more by the practical calculation of whether anyone is actually awake at the switch to enforce it, which leaves us with a final, deeply provocative question that I want you to mull over.
This is the big one.
Yeah. We've established that Loper Bright empowers federal judges today to read the law fresh. Imagine that tomorrow a federal judge looks at the plain text of 52 U.S.C. section 30121, exercises their new independent authority, and officially strikes down the FEC's 1989 ballot measure exception, ruling that it was always an illegal interpretation.
That is the ultimate stress test of our legal and constitutional system.
Exactly, because what happens to the past? What happens to the hundreds of millions of dollars that Hans-Jürgen West and the 1630 Fund have already spent? But more importantly, what happens to the actual law?
The ones that already passed.
Right. Could past political victories entire state constitutional amendments regarding voting rights, minimum wages, or tax policies that were built on the back of that newly declared illegal foreign funding be legally contested and unraveled after the fact?
Staggering thought.
Or does the American political system simply have to swallow the profound, permanent constitutional changes wrought by a defunct loophole? The law may change tomorrow, but the ink on the state constitutions is already dry. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the statute book. Keep questioning the architecture behind the headlines, and we will see you next time.
Coming next, the SPLC thread, Part 5, The Pipes, where the money starts, what it flows through, where it lands. Follow the channel.